This is our seventh. This is our seventh forum since we began, and so I'd like to welcome everybody here, and those who haven't been here, and those who have been here before. So I don't have too much to say on this particular subject, other than we're working on some long-term changes, and which I can't discuss, which will keep the forum going for many, many, many years to come if we can make all of that work. So this one's has a different approach to it, and we have this wonderful collection of papers that are here from last year that individually are unusual, but when taken collectively shows us the diversity of the reaction to the work, and I think that that's a terrific thing. I'm really thanks to James for that, because he's the one who suggested that we take this approach. And so this year we have a new group of writers, and of course our intent is to have the same kind of freedom of expression within those essays, and by the time we have this collection, hope to have this wide diversity of the way of being able to look at the work, and I really, really appreciate it. And as we go into these conversations today, I don't want to dominate them. I have no interest in that, because I have so much interest in hearing what others have to say about the work. So, but I will comment and maybe lead the comment on a few things that maybe some people wouldn't have thought of in relationship to the questions that James is going to ask. So that's all I have to say, other than I'm really glad that everyone's here. This is great.
Okay, is that working? Okay, good morning, everyone. So as you'll see from the agenda, I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes or so, just to get the whole thing rolling. Oh, it's very loud. But first, I really just want to reiterate what Karun said, and to thank Jeffrey and Betty so much for generously hosting us yet again on the island. It's not always easy to have guests, but it's particularly difficult when those guests happen to be a rowdy bunch like us. And we appreciate very much, Betty put so much work into the beautiful food, whether it's the breakfast or the lunches or the dinner last night. Betty put so much work behind the scenes into making this so enjoyable. And, you know, Jeffrey, it must sometimes be difficult to have all these talkative people coming around and talking about your art. So thank you so much for having us. I also want to, of course, thank Karun, the mastermind of all of this. I continue to be amazed at Karun's brilliance when it comes to organization. He's so diligent, so precise. How you manage to get people from all around the world to this island is beyond me, and you do it always with a smile on your face. So thank you so much for making these forums always so successful. Anyway, most of you, I think maybe all of you know me by now. This is my fourth time on Hornby Island. I've been coming here every May since 2011. And I feel like a bit of a local now, actually. I've even got myself a Sea Air baseball cap. So, although I continue to resist the temptation that is the Caesar cocktail. Mark over there actually tried to see his first Caesar last night. He's still recovering this morning. But why do I keep coming back? Well, it's not only because of the float plane, although that is a great draw. It's not only because of the fantastic food and drink that Betty provides. It's not only because of the great company here, and it's not only because of the beauty of this island, and it has looked particularly beautiful the last 24 hours. I keep coming back because I think what we've actually got going on here is really rather unique. To my knowledge, it's very rare indeed to find an artist who has produced such a huge body of work over such a long period of time, and then had the ability to keep ownership of that work and then to display it, to curate it exactly as he wants over a vast terrain. So I think the Sculpture Park is a really rare, and we'll talk about how rare it is, but I think it's extremely rare. And rarer still that artist would welcome us to come in to his private space, to let us discuss, debate, disagree with him. So for me, the Jeffrey Rubinoff Sculpture Park is an extraordinary place. And these forums, I think, offer a unique opportunity for anyone who's interested in art or interested in the psychology of the artist to learn a huge amount. So that's why I keep coming back. But I learn more and more every single year. And then, of course, there is the work itself. Now, we're going to discuss the work over the next couple of days, and I hope we're going to disagree about it. That's my ambition anyway. I hope we can disagree about its form, its meaning, its significance. But I think the thing that I feel is I think this park contains some genuinely remarkable art. I remain obsessed with the great Series 3 and Series 4 pieces, those huge Core 10 steel pieces. The new writers here, we've walked past them, but we haven't really discussed them yet. For me, those pieces, possess a power and a beauty and a complexity that is a hallmark of the very finest sculpture. They remind me of the, I don't know what the name for them is, Peter, but they remind me of the great sort of anti-tank defences that lined the beaches in the Second World War and, and the beaches of the Normandy landing. But the thing that makes them so great for me is that they possess a formal logic of their own. As with so much of Jeffrey's work, his series unfold like a single line of argument over multiple pieces. And as the way that technology becomes more efficient over time and organic, natural organisms evolve over millennia, Jeffrey's pieces seem to be tinkered with. He adds features, removes features, changes features, pushes things until everything that can be said has been said, and the series ends and a new series begins. So, in my opinion, this park is a site of such cultural importance and rare, it's such a rare thing, and it's of such scale and such importance that I think it needs to be talked about. It needs to be written about as well. And that's obviously the point of these forums. And I think the only reason it hasn't been written about, the only reason it hasn't been talked about much, is partly because of its geographical position, far away from the cultural capitals of Europe and the East Coast. And I think it's partly because Jeffrey has rejected the art world and the art market that provides the institutions that enable these things to be discussed. So I really hope that with these forums we are able to discuss what's going on here. And also to write about what's going on here. Jeffrey, I think, has raised it very briefly that, I'm charged with the job of overseeing, of assembling, and of editing a book, the first book about Jeffrey's art. And it currently has the very imaginative title, The Art of Jeffrey Rubinoff. We try and get something a little bit more dramatic for the final thing if we want. And I'm very pleased to announce that the book is under contract with Douglas and McIntyre. It was a major academic publisher. Thanks very much to Maria Tippett for putting us in touch. So it's under contract, which is great news. And my hope is to finish the manuscript by the end of the summer of next year. And hopefully, depending on how quickly we can move, the book could be out at maybe the end of next year or sometime in first half of 2016. The book is a collection of essays. It's not one voice. I think that would be wrong in this instance. But it's multiple voices, many different academics, different writers in various fields. And we have given them huge liberty to respond to the park in their own way. And I have to, I'm very grateful to Jeffrey for allowing them that and for not trying to push them one way or another. It's not always easy to see your work written about by someone who has a different view to you, but I think it's an important part of the process. And I'm sure you will remember the four amusing guys I brought last year. Dr. Aaron Rosen, the guy with the curly hair, who came from King's College London. Tom Stammers, the Hugh Grant lookalike, who came from University of Durham. James Purden and Alex Mazouras. And all of them, I think, you have the essays. Has everyone got the essays and the papers? Many of you may have read them already. Yeah, these are some of the papers. They are a unique, they're a wonderful bunch of papers, actually. They're so varied, so different. They all take completely different approaches to Geoffrey's work. Some of them you may not find as convincing as others, but that's part of academia. That's part of how writing is. So the first one was Aaron Rosen's piece. He tried to connect Geoffrey's ideas to his Jewish identity. I'm not sure how much Geoffrey agreed with it, but that's how it goes. And I am pleased to say that the piece. I think the piece was beautifully written, and it's a really engaging piece. And as you may see, it also appeared in the Jewish Quarterly. Very well illustrated, very well received. So it's a really interesting approach. James Purden wrote a fascinating essay. It was an essay that, when I first conceived of the book, I didn't realize that steel and the poetics and the politics of metal could be the subject for an essay here. But I think he's done a really good job in putting together an essay that sort of ties Rubinoff's work to the broader study of the cultural associations of steel. Tom Stammers wrote a piece that everyone who's read has just been amazed by. I mean, his erudition, his wide reading, his intelligence is extremely impressive. And he wrote a piece that connected Geoffrey's cultural ideas to some of the ideas of the Enlightenment. And you were very impressed by that piece, weren't you, Geoffrey? It's a great piece. And last but not least, Alex Mazouras, himself an artist, produced this study of the ruin. It's hot off the press. He finished it about a week ago, sent it to me a few days ago. So please do tuck into those pieces. But these are just the first four. It's just the beginning. I will be writing an essay about my old favourites, series 3 and 4. I'm going to tuck into that later on this year. And I'm going to have a proper look at them again this weekend. Maria Tippett and Peter Clark, who are regulars at the forum, they have agreed to write pieces, and I'm delighted that they're going to be contributing to the book because they know Geoffrey and his work better than almost anyone. Jenny is who's probably, are you the longest standing visitor to the party? Have you been here many more years than anyone, apart from Geoffrey?
Contributing, yes.
So
she's written, I guess, the most amount of papers, probably, of anyone, yeah.
Oh, so there you go. So Jenny is going to write it's going to be the very beginning of the book, the long chronology that basically sets up everything about that we need to know about Geoffrey. And I hear she's hoping to write it over the summer. That is, unless her beautiful boy, which we were all wowed by last night, Abner, allows her to do so. And of course, Professor Jay Winter, who some of you remember from a few years ago, who brought so many of us together, has agreed to write a foreword to the book as well. So it's great to have him anchoring it in that way. But now I just want to introduce you to the 4 new writers that I've brought this year. And I will proceed alphabetically, and also, in fact, probably by height order, because I'm beginning with this man over there, the man who's still struggling post-Caesar. Mark Breeze. This is Mark over there in the black jacket and the slightly sick expression on his face. Mark has an extremely impressive CV. In fact, I mean, I've been friends with Mark for years, but when I read his CV, I felt sort of too scared to even talk to him. He is an Emmy-nominated filmmaker. He's a Harvard-trained architect. He's a Cambridge-based academic. He's practiced architecture in Beijing, in Boston, in London, in New York. He's worked with Norman Foster. He's worked with Colin St. John Wilson. And in 2012, he was field director, producer, architectural consultant to this internationally acclaimed documentary about the rebuilding of Ground Zero after 9/11, which he did with Discovery Channel, DreamWorks, and Steven Spielberg. So we're very lucky to have Mark here, and being a trained architect, I'm hoping that he is going to write about the sort of architectural and spatial dynamics of the park. So how we understand not so much the individual sculptures, but the spaces that are created by Jeffrey. Next we have Joan. Is it Packner or Patchner?
It sounds like a K.
Packner.
That's what made it sounds like a K.
Okay, this is Joan Packner here. She comes to us from the United States. She's an independent art historian who specializes in modern sculpture, lectures at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. She is one of the world's leading authorities on David Smith, who's an artist to whom Jeffrey owes so much and by whom he was so inspired. She's written widely on Smith's life, widely on Smith's work. And in her most recent, was it your most recent book, which was published at the beginning of 2013? A wonderful book, beautiful book about David Smith for Phaidon, which, there it is indeed. It's a beautiful book, and I think Jeffrey's a big fan of that book as well. So it's nice to bring people together. And I'm hoping that Joan will write something about Jeffrey's early work, his relationship to Smith, the debt he owes to David Smith. It would be fantastic. She comes with the blessing of the David Smith estate, and indeed the David Smith estate has given their blessing to this whole project, and that's really lovely to know, and they're very excited to see what we produce. Next we have, in the white shirt, pretending to write something, Barry Phipps. Barry is a British curator. He's taught and studied philosophy, art history, and the history and philosophy of architecture at Warwick, at Cambridge, at Oxford. He's interested. You're very interested in the relationship between artistic practice and scientific research, which is something that Jeffrey is also interested in. And Barry has also curated many exhibitions in the United Kingdom, or all over the place. He also happens to be curator of the art collection at Churchill College in Cambridge. I was once a fellow at Churchill College. Maria as well, related to Churchill. And it's a wonderful collection. It's a kind of sculpture park in its own right that Barry looks after. And it has some magnificent pieces of work, including a monumental sculpture by Barbara Hepworth. And I think, Jeffrey, you've seen some of the sculptures there, haven't you?
Yes,
in the park.
Yes, it's a really great collection. I like that.
So that's wonderful. And I'm hoping that Barry might write something about Jeffrey's working methods. Maybe he'll even get into the studio. We never know. So that would be lovely. And last, but by no means least, of course, is Francis Stoner Saunders, who is here on the left. Now, I have been a fan of Francis's work for a long time. I've admired her work for a long time. I remember reading her book, this book over here, The Cultural Cold War, when I was a teenager. And when I first met her at a dinner... Very recently, 2 or 3 years ago. And anyway, I was at a dinner party last year, and Frances happened to be there, and I was, overawed by this, and thought I'd pounce immediately and see if I could get her to come to Canada. She agreed, and I'm completely delighted she's here. She is one of the leading cultural commentators in the United Kingdom. She's a magnificent writer, a journalist, a broadcaster. She's written made some fantastic television programs, fantastic radio programs, and this book is a book that always made me think of Jeffrey. So she is a specialist in the Cold War, but she's a specialist in so many other things as well. So maybe she'll write about the Cold War context. Maybe she'll find something else she wants to write about. I'm really excited to see what she comes up with. Anyway, so I'm coming to the end now, I promise. Now I've introduced the writers, I'd just like to very briefly outline... Oh yes, well, Maria and Peter obviously are stalwarts here. I'm not sure if they need introduction, but Maria and Peter have you been coming since 2010 or 11?
11.
So Maria and Peter have arrived. Yeah, Maria and Peter have been coming here. They come from Pender Island, and they've been coming since 2011 as well. Maria is one of the leading cultural historians in Canada who has written marvelous books. I remember reading her book as a teenager as well, about the First World War, which has recently been reissued. And Peter was Master of Trinity Hall, Professor of History at Cambridge. I remember meeting them when I was a teenager as well. Maria used to run a really fantastic seminar in Trinity Hall, and I think I went to one that you had Anthony Caro coming to, and that was my first meeting with Anthony, well, my only meeting with Anthony Caro, but it was exciting nonetheless. So it's great to have those two here as well, and I'm so pleased that they are going to be contributing to the book. So anyway, now I've introduced the writers. I'd just like to say a little bit about how this the forum's going to work. The first important thing to note is that we have dispensed with the usual format of the papers, a couple of papers in the morning. Now, don't get me wrong, I think we've had some fantastic papers over the years, but my feeling was that with the papers, one of the results of that was we ended up with too much talking at this end of the table and too much listening at that end of the table. And what I want to have is a much more inclusive discussion where everyone can talk, everyone can feel free to converse. I don't think there should be any hierarchies here at all. That's why this seating plan is very successful. We are all as equals, I think, and I really want everyone to feel that they can all contribute equally to this discussion. To do this, I've structured this morning's session and tomorrow morning's session around 6 questions. You can find them on the agenda. Now, these questions have been chosen quite carefully. They've been chosen quite carefully. The first reason I've chosen them is that I think they allow us to explore a very wide range of issues that pertain to the park. Secondly, they are phrased in a particular way so that they can invite different registers of response. Highbrow response, lowbrow response, theoretical, personal, anecdotal. Everyone is encouraged to make their own contribution. It doesn't have to be high-end academia and theory to do that. So they've been phrased in that way. And the final reason for the choice of questions is that they focus on issues that the individual writers are eventually probably going to write about. So the sculpture park is something that Mark is going to write about. David Smith is something that Joan is going to write about. So we're trying to make it so that there are people here who can, the writers can learn from the discussions, and also the writers who are specializing in these topics can contribute to these discussions, and maybe even if they want to lead those discussions. So we'll take about 30 minutes per question, and that will take us up for lunch, to lunchtime. I'll just briefly elaborate on each question, just for 20 seconds before we start. Jeffrey may make some comments at the beginning, or he may decide to do them at the end or weigh in at any other point. But really, I just encourage everyone to speak up and say whatever they want to say. As I say, it doesn't have to be academic. What we just want is good, interesting discussion where we can have debate about this remarkable place. So we may as well get started on the questions if people want. Go on, Corinne.
I just wanted to say that I've put mics sort of hopefully distributed where everyone can reach them. And when you do speak, just try and hold them about this far so that we can get your voice recorded and also everyone can hear you. If it looks like we need a coffee break sometime, I might just give us a 15-minute break. But I think we're all caffeinated enough for the first half hour, maybe hour. All right. So, and the format is that James, you'll present the question and your thinking behind the kind of context, and then Jeffrey, you'll have a chance to respond, and then we'll go on to the dialogue. All right. And you can just raise your hand or let me know. I'll put you on the list.
Yeah, just go for it. That's what I say. I think the more voices we hear, the more debate we can get, and the more interesting this is going to be, I think, for all of us. So please don't be shy. It's a small group. So anyway, question number one is this: how important is the sculpture park to understanding the sculptures within it? Now, as anyone who's walked around this park will know, it's vast. It's a vast arena. It covers about 50 hectares. It's about 50 hectares, Jeffrey?
Yeah, the park itself, probably, yeah.
About 50 hectares, and obviously it's growing. New parts of the park are being developed. It contains more than 100 of Jeffrey's sculptures, and that's going up by probably one a year.
Yeah.
All of which have been very carefully positioned by Jeffrey himself. So the questions that I'd like us to explore over the next half an hour on this subject is: how can we make sense of the park? What are its principles? How does it differ from other comparable sculpture parks? So those of us who actually have been to other sculpture parks, what's different about this one and how it works, what's different and what's similar? And I suppose most importantly in some ways, how does the park affect our understanding of the individual sculptures? If those sculptures were moved to different parts of the park, or to different places altogether, or to be seen indoors, as these early works were originally intended to be seen, how would that change those pieces? And should we see the park simply as a setting, a beautiful setting for this lovely art, this great art, or should we see it as a kind of artwork in its own right? So these are the kind of questions that would be great to explore and to hear your views on. So let's get started. Jeffrey, is there anything you want to say first about this?
Yeah. On this one, I'd like to overlay something that I've probably never said before. So this is why we'll go back right to the originality of the park. It was first bought with the understanding that, like David Smith, I would likely end up with 95% of my inventory, and I didn't want to have any orphans. So it began there on buying the farm in the first place back in 41 years ago. The first order of business was to work the land and get rid of the little fences and other things and have a vision of the land itself, which automatically turned towards what the conceptual sculptors were doing at that time, and that included De Maria and his lightning field, James Turrell, which James has mentioned a few years ago, who's done the crater. He didn't mention Michael Heiser. Michael Heiser's been out in the middle of the desert working on a project probably for the last 40 years as well. So there's a number of them that were there, and I had this large piece of land which seemed almost like a large three-dimensional canvas. When I began this period of work, I did it after they had begun their work and had decided on a different way of approaching the project itself. So the first thing was locating a spot, which is right outside of the barn, where each piece could stand on its own. And this is really an important aspect of it, was that I foresaw that the pieces should and could still go to show. I was always waiting for a turnaround in the art market where it would come back to the historical sense of what sculpture was. The purpose in beginning this particular project was to restate the importance of art history itself rather than undercutting it or just simply using it to destroy in order to build avant-garde work. And so there was two choices on the pivot at that particular point. One was, do these pieces stand on their own? And this particular spot that I chose and where I photographed was just outside the barn. So the barn structure was part of it. The views were all part of it, and the incredible sculptural environment that's around us had the ability to squash this piece. So if a piece, didn't matter what size it was, could stand on its own with this environment, then I felt like it was a strong enough piece on its own. And that's an interesting thing, because no one would have thought of that once you see them collectively. And so I wanted a very different project than the other guys were doing, which was dedicated to a single project. What I wanted to do was dedicate the park to where we are now. Art is a source of knowledge, and that's meant that some pieces might inevitably be sold, other ones, so they couldn't really be placed on the property as part of the permanent part. So placing the work in those years was not one of the questions. Gathering the land together and putting the land together in such a way that it could be used as a park was something that has gone on since 1973, and really done intensely since I've met John, and we've drained it and done those things, which really began in 1987. In the 90s, I was doing the smaller pieces, and they were easier to show, and a friend of mine and I set up a gallery at 18th and 6th Street in New York, which Marlborough quickly followed us. In about 6 months, they were like a block and a half away with us with their Chelsea gallery. And we did historical shows that were based on each one. We were very different sculptors with very, very different points of view. And so each one of us would choose pieces or have pieces chosen for us that were part of our own history in what it made. We did that for 2 years. They were small pieces. They were either contributed by artists or contributed by dealers, and it was a time when the dealers themselves were having trouble selling small sculpture even. So these are the coffee table pieces that we talked about. I've talked about. And we had incredible shows where we could show all the way back to our own history in modernism, and with pieces from the dealers themselves would produce for us. And they were really excellent shows. So having the work available for showing was one of the most important parts of that particular stage. After I was finally disgusted enough with New York, which came by about 1998, I started to place the pieces. And placing the pieces here meant finding the exact right sites for them. If the site wasn't exactly right, then we would adapt the site so that we would re-landscape the site to make it perfect for those pieces. Now, what it meant is that the pieces would ring into certain areas of the park. So this part of the phase of the park where you see the interrelationship of the work is from 1998 on. It was not something that was conceived of from the beginning. From the beginning, this was meant to be a repository for work that would go to show, as I did many times, and would come back, which it would do. So I kept the work collected in a small area just above the barn in order to be able to have it accessible, to grab it and send it off to show. So in 1998, that's when we really began the spread. But because I had been party to every aspect of what we were doing within the park, then I understood where the siting might be. And then I would just spend time thinking, well, where should this piece go? And we would try it. In most cases, we could find the place where the piece rang in, but in several cases, we found that we couldn't find that. And a piece that was in the wrong place would just make my teeth grit. It would just be very upsetting to me. I couldn't stand it. John knows this. Until I said, this has got to go. So we would find we would locate it another place, and eventually we find the place for that piece to ring in to the rest of the park. So that's how that happened. I probably never have discussed that before. So in the beginning, the idea was not to dedicate the park to a single use, not to dedicate the work to a single use, but rather to dedicate the work to a continuation of art history, and the challenge of art history itself being the basis of a creative run. And this was So that made it quite different in that at that point there was quite an awareness of what was going on out in the world, in the art world. And the truth is that it's very, very hard to sell sculpture, solid sculpture. It takes over people's lives, and you just have to have the right collectors to buy it. I did at one point have a fine collector who bought, and came out here in the middle of winter, bought a cross-section of the entire work. And the reason why I sold it to him is that he had built on a piece of land outside of Toronto, which had all of the attributes of being a beautiful sculpture location. And in that particular case, since we had no perpetuity in mind as to how the park would work, it looked like he would be a better caretaker of this work than I could be. So this was one of the reasons why I actually sold it. In the course of events, I bought several of those pieces back. And so, but not all. So some of the pieces, he kept some of the pieces that were there. So it's not as easy as you might think when you look at the park, but you have to account for this history that it could have spread either way, that this was in mind, and both things were going on in parallel at the time. And this is part of something, the reason why I'm commenting at this point was that I think that that's an important key to what you're asking. So I think I've answered it. So that part which I want to do, and then I would hope that everybody else has some other opinion and can add to that. So.
Okay, let's. Karun, do you want to manage the? Okay, Peter.
Can I just clarify? This is on, isn't it? Yeah. Can I just clarify one point in your exposition there? Jeffrey, a couple of times at least, you seem to lay great emphasis on the unique problem of citing a particular piece of sculpture. And yet it seems to me, perhaps wrongly, perhaps naively, or perhaps mistakenly in some other way, that when we go into the park, it is the grouping of the series that it also has significance here. Could you just reconcile that and explain what you really meant there?
Yeah, each piece was done one at a time, so that it was an evolutionary statement. And after the third piece of the first series that's there, I determined that rather than ever having 5, 6 pieces going at the same time, such as when I did the earlier work, I would only do one at a time, since I felt like I had crossed the threshold into original art using this history, building on this history, this evolutionary history. Then each piece would have to have something added to it that I had never seen before, and of course was never part of the work before, and that was measurable. And so the reason why I saved even the first several pieces, I should have, I knew they were career breakers, those first few pieces as an avant-garde artist, because the kiss of death from a dealer is the word derivative, right? Which is ridiculous, since every other art forever has relied on its predecessors. Only the moronic thing of avant-garde novelty can possibly use that word. But in any case, it's the kiss of death, and I knew that that would be the kiss of death of that first series. But what I also realized is that if I was going to dedicate myself to the growth of the history, then I would have to be able to demonstrate how the pieces grew one at a time. And so the grouping of the series is such that it can show that part, the growth within the series. And I felt like in order to make the argument, the historical argument that was here, and since I knew I would only sell very few pieces anyway, it didn't really matter, that by keeping the groups in that order, and it's still the order that I take people around on the tours, at least in the first area, then each one of those pieces can demonstrate that particular change, something that where it went from A to B. And since the commitment was to the question of whether or not art history could provide a creative run, then it should be evident. And so each piece became an argument in art history for that originality, and I wanted it demonstrable on a tour through the park, and that's still the way that I do it.
Joan.
I had a quick question. Did you ever consider showing the work of others?
Yeah, the difficulty is that once the work became placed, it took up all its space. And so right now, like for example, all of the lower part of the park, the problem is that if you had seen the work in 1998, you would have looked at a used car lot of sculpture on about 2.5 acres. And nobody had any idea that there was that much work there until I actually spread it out. But once it spread out, it just took up all of the space. And so now the only space I have left is for the pieces that I actually am expanding. Yes, I really have thought about that.
You need a bigger park.
I need a bigger park. So it just filled it up. And you can see, all of those areas we walked through yesterday are full except for the areas that I purposefully have left spaces for future expansion, you know, and there's like only 4 or 5 sites left.
How would you, what kind of changes would you envision? And what do you think, what's going to happen? Like, as things grow, what do you do with them?
Such as?
As the trees grow.
We've calculated quite a bit on those trees, on how they will grow, where they will grow, and what they'll do when they grow. We planted the perimeter to block out the power lines, and we still are just at the edge of doing it and rescuing ourselves from our power company is called BC Hydro. So if I use the word hydro pole, it refers to our electrical poles out there. We're just now being able to communicate with them that this is really important for you not to come over the property and trim all of those trees down and take it back to where it was. So we know which trees will grow to which height and when. And we're now calculating that they'll put in a 50-foot pole one day. So we're calculating the trees for that to match that particular thing. So we're thinking about that all the time as part of it. And what we found is that these Austrian pines that are like right out here will only grow at about 30 feet here. And so now, and what we found is that we planted these black pines all over the place, and they're self-pruning. They'll grow to maybe 25 feet, the ones that we planted, and then they have this bulge on it, and then the tops fall off. And we think this is absolutely great because you want a low set of trees as well as the firs. The firs here have a strange history because if they grow in a group, they grow very tall. Only it's very wet here, and this is not great fir country, it's cedar country. And what happens is they become a sail and they get blown over in the wind. So a smart fir is one that only grows to 30 feet, 40 feet, and grows very, very bushy. So we're aware of how these different trees grow, given the environment for them. If you plant a fir out in the open, chances are it's going to spread out this way and only grow to about 30 or 40 feet. We have several of those. So once you know the sizes of them, you can know the horizon that you're looking at. Eventually, some we may have to trim, but yeah, very, very aware of it all the time.
Okay, so we have Barry and then Mark to say something.
So I hope this doesn't overlap with what you're going to ask, but I'm really interested in the process of citing the work. I mean, this is something that I deal with quite often, in fact, and it's always a difficult process to talk about, I guess, because it's personal, it's about finding balance. But you talked about having the wrong space and then changing it. So it might be a nice way to talk about the process of citing something in its negative. So what did you consider was wrong with the site before you changed it?
That's really interesting. I don't know. Only that it would irritate me and make me very agitated and very upset. And some of these pieces were like right in my path to the studio. And so I was upset every time I went to the studio and every time I left the studio.
But is it visually something that's out of kilter with the landscape?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It just is the wrong place for that piece. Now, you know, that piece was placed there right after it was created, and it's never been moved. So that piece hit the right space. It rang in, and there's never been a reason to move it. And the same thing with the third piece in that series.
Yeah.
And so it's never been moved. But the other ones have all been shifted around one way or the other. And very often it's like, does this piece work with any sense of longevity as it sits in this thing? So it's part of the whole composition. Is it working within the composition? Now, the other thing, and why I can say so easily that it's full, is that what I've tried to do in designing the layout of the pieces is that you see them individually from the maximum amount of area, and the maximum amount of perspectives. It's a bit linear down here, so they will tend to overlap, but as you move up in the park, you can start to see them individually. And so the object is to have as few clustered together, a few crossing each other from the perspective of the view, and to maximize the perspectives that we actually have within this environment. So that's how they were laid out. The ones that were wrong, just were wrong. They just but there weren't that many. There were like 2 or 3 of them, and they ended up being placed. One of them ended up being placed well out of order in terms of the walking. Yeah. So sometimes the walking goes back and forth, several times.
And how much has this process developed? Because in the first instance, you were citing works on a site which had been made independently of the site. But now you have the luxury of finding the site first, almost. Is that how it happens now? You choose a location and then make a work?
Well, the way that we're working now in that expansion area is that we've had to create the whole expansion area. I mean, it just needed to be created. The area above the pond, this was the 4th clearing of it. The first clearing of it was when the pond itself was done, and there were these giant cedar stumps in here. So this is what they really wanted here. When they preempted the land, he was a fruit planter, and it's a very interesting thing in BC. Everything has to be built around fruit trees because it was the way of preempting the land. It's just a very odd relationship with things. And this guy planted through the Okanagan, which is the interior area, and went down to Victoria, and his name was Heatherbell, great name. He planted Heatherbell Road, so there's still an orchard all along this Heatherbell Road, and then he came to Hornby. This was his last stop so far, moving east. And so he planted the orchards here. So these orchards are very, very old. And he preempted it, I said, from Phipps Point, which is the entire west side of the island, to where you came in, right? That's what he preempted. Now, I always wondered what it was he after, because the land couldn't have been worth very much. And it's those cedars, those giant cedars that were here. And they came with the springs, so they could absorb the water that was here, but they were replaced by different growth, including the fir trees. And the firs will grow where they're really well drained, but they've already ruined the drainage. By the time they've used these donkey engines to pull things out, they spread water everywhere, and they've created swamps where there were no swamps before. So the poor fir trees are really up against it. And so we know now how to give the firs a maximum amount. We'll trench all around them, make sure that they can root and hold down their roots the way they are. Knowing that if they grow out in the open and they have the soil, then you grow them low. So these are all the things that we're really conscious of. Now, how does that go with the citing? Well, when you're creating sites, you've got to keep all of that in mind. And like I said, we cleared that first clearing the stumps above the pond, then there was nothing but rocks in it. So then a cat turned it over and rolled out a whole bunch of rocks. That didn't do much. Then there was one more clearing after that, and then probably another clearing. We finally got it turned over, and we finally could grow something on it where we could actually, control the parkland itself. So that's the manufacture of sites here. And once you do that, you're just absolutely committed. You've got to start thinking, how is this going to organize? How are you going to make this thing work?
Barry, can I ask you a question? As someone who also has to position sculptures in spaces, do you have any principles that you work from? I mean, are you just thinking of the best site for an individual sculpture and doing that one by one, or are you thinking of a path that a viewer might take, or a larger whole? How do you do that?
In many respects, all of those things, in fact. It was striking yesterday when we arrived and Jeffrey was talking about counterpoints, because that's one of the basic principles of sighting outdoor work. You want to play it off with things either symmetrically, asymmetrically, use all of these devices in which to create both an independence for the work, but also a context within a wider setting. So,
Yeah.
Are there principles for that?
I think it's pretty instinctual.
Yeah.
Yeah. You have to have this ability to have visual counterpoint. That's one of the things. It's like hearing, being able to hear Bach, for example, to hear the voices in Bach.
But is that something the artist would share is that something the artist would share with the curator, if you know what I mean?
I would love that to happen, and it does happen at times. You know, that's a beauty. The one thing I can't remember if I said it or not. The difference between the evolutionary statement of oral counterpoint. I did say that was fight or flight, but I'm not sure I said that visual counterpoint's about hunting and gathering, where we take all of this in and then can bring a focus this way, but we take the entire environment in with our eyes and then organize it. So the people who can cite these things really have the ability to compose within the realm of visual counterpoint. So it's not just the visual counterpoint in the pieces that go into a white cube. That's the smallest part of it. It becomes much larger once you take the pieces out here.
Mark, do you want to say something?
Jeffrey, firstly, I'd just like to reiterate my huge thanks for hosting all of this to both you and Betty. It's a wonderful occasion. We're all very honoured to be here. Thank you. I guess I had a sort of slightly, taking a step back, a slightly more fundamental question of what is the sculpture park? I mean, is that Hornby Island? Does that include Vancouver Island? And I'm particularly interested because we're very lucky to have residents, people who know you and know the island very well here, because you're on such an open site. You know, it's so framed by the very distant view, the mountains from millions of years ago. You know, it's ambiguous where the edge of the park is. Is it the edge of the moan? Is it the edge of the acreage of the forest beyond? And those boundaries we're not really so aware of. And also given the approach here, you know, it's such an interesting set of approaches, whether you either fly in or come up the track. Like, where does that experience of the sculpture park begin? So I'm interested both sort of
That has to do with
your take.
The issues of visual counterpoint, which are infinite. I mean, yes, you're right. You're dead on. There's no limits to it. The difference is that in the old hunting and gathering days, first they started with a spear, so they actually had a much shorter vision as to what they would have to do, but they would also have to hunt over whatever vision that they had over that particular horizon. Our horizons have really grown, obviously, with airplanes and our ability to see beyond. So yeah, I can't see where that stops. I agree with you. There are no edges to it. I will admit to one thing. I have been very, very proprietary with the views over the property. And so we have screened out the neighbors so that the park has a sense of its wildness all the way around and on all of its borders. The original farm was bare land, fence post to fence post, and that's all been changed by the planting that we've done.
So you're curating the views both in and out?
Yes. Yeah.
I don't want a big hotel to go up opposite. And I wonder, the question for the...
Can I get some response from the locals, if I may, for me?
Yeah, I have a local response, because I started viewing the park from way up there on top of Mount Jeffrey, which was, of course, named after Jeff. And I originally thought it was, there were cows here, and it was a farm, but then the cows never moved. And then over time, we got to know Jeff and Betty and got closer to the works over the decades and spent more and more time here. So one thing for your book and for the perspective, I think it might be interesting to come, not to be a troublemaker, but more often and in different seasons. Because to me, the pieces and how the viewer relates to them change so much between May and October. And not only do they change as they would normally as you walk around them, and then every day, of course, the exogenous variable is the weather. And at least to me, that changes how I see them or how I feel about them, every time I come here. So to talk about the question is that the park is so important because it is, as important or as the sculptures, as the works, to me anyway. I'm an amateur, you guys are professionals. So that's very, very important, and that's what's so exciting about it, and even better than a urban sculpture garden like the one, I don't know, outside of the Smithsonian or something. It will change with the weather, but it doesn't change like this place changes. It's totally unique, and maybe as you write about it or think about it or make that big commentary in the book, really, one ought to look at it in the seasons.
It's a good point to make.
And we can make some photos available in different seasons, right? We do have that possibility if everyone can't make it back in all 4 seasons.
Do you feel you live on the park? Do you feel you live on the park?
Do I live on? No.
Do you feel you live on the park?
On a park.
On the park. Do you feel you live on the sculpture park? Even though obviously practically you don't, but...
No. I live on my own park in another place on this beautiful island.
Don't forget your microphone.
John, I wonder what you think, as a man who knows this park at all seasons, all times. Do you think does the effect on the sculptures change throughout the year depending on the seasons?
Absolutely. I was telling Mark about this on the way coming over, that you're seeing it at the greenest of greens right now, and grass and everything's growing and trees are out, but you come here in September when everything is brown. There's no attempt to water the grounds here. So it goes into its fall state and before hibernation, and of course the lights those time of year change, and you get into the late fall where the low sunlight, it changes the art completely. Different shadows. A couple of weeks ago, we were viewing it with someone from Vancouver Island, and the shadows that were being cast with the early morning lights were incredible. Those shadows you don't get in the fall. I mean, you suddenly have 2 pieces of sculpture almost taking place, one with the real piece and then the shadows. And I think a lot of that is in the positioning that Jeffrey was alluding to, is room to walk around and see those shadows and the light. And you really, throughout the whole year into the winter, and you get gray light, and so you have no shadows, and the pieces can glow. So very much, it's... and we just have the park to ourselves then.
So we have, please, and then Joan. Oh, Miriam.
Yeah, just one comment. Jeffrey, you told me, and I quote, "I knew the minute I spread the works out, I would never move them again." What would happen if the director of MoMA came along and said, "We'd like to give you a big show"?
Wherever they show it. That's an interesting question, because lining up on how the park will live in perpetuity, and I'm fixing the spots. We managed to survey. Did I tell you how we surveyed? We got everything surveyed. We just did it a few weeks ago. It's a brand new process, and it's very, very affordable to do as many things as we did. We did the entire property, end to end. Every drain that John has put in. And the way it was done was by GPS. And you'd think, well, how accurate is that? Because the military always kept it down. It's not done with military, well, it may be military satellites, but these satellites flow by. He catches 9 satellites at a time, so he gets the information from 9, and he's accurate to 2 centimeters. And so all he has to do is walk around here with a device. He has this little thing that's set up like a a little space needle, this very small space needle on top of a tripod, and then he goes everywhere and he presses his waypoints, and out comes these maps. So every piece now is locked down to 2 centimeters, and I realize that they can't, if I can move them, then they can move them, and I just think that they've got to be fixed.
We have another question.
Or not so much.
A statement.
Yeah, maybe a statement asking Jeffrey maybe to say a bit more, because we do see the vista and the sculptures against the vista, and that's beautiful. But I remember on one of the tours you were talking about the mountain, and I always think that makes this place very special, because a lot of where you cited captures different angles with your sculpture, and you made that point on the tour, and it would be hard to move them, some of them, from where you've put them in relation to the mountain.
Yeah.
Jen, did you have your hand up, or?
I did, but I actually have a separate question.
Okay, so shall we? Maybe Barry wants to speak.
I thought Maria's question was very insightful, in fact, and responded well to the original question of how much our understanding of the work depends on its context. And I don't think it was answered so much. Whether you can take the sculptures out of the park and put them somewhere else and still have the same or a similar relationship with them, that's it.
Well, I mean, I always, this is a question that goes to the curators, and obviously the sculpture park and the beautiful setting has a huge impact and a wonderful impact on the sculptures. But as curators, can it be quite intimidating if your environment in which you're citing the work is so overwhelmingly beautiful? I mean, is there a risk that it can overwhelm the artworks within? I mean, you probably don't have that problem with the White Cube gallery, but I mean, it'd be interesting to know from a curator's perspective.
I have 2 comments. It's a really great question. I spent the better part of 10 years in and out of Storm King Art Center, where I still go, and that's one of the few places that has a commensurate point of view, where there's some works are site-specific, some works have the land adapted to the pieces, and there are many different environments within the overall park. It also is oriented towards a distant landscape, which at one point the park actually owned the mountain, then sold it to a nature conservancy, which has agreed to preserve it in perpetuity. So it really completely on the same wavelength. If a work of yours were to go to a place like Storm King, well, that would be a unique instance where of a like-minded place. But I cannot imagine it going to almost any other setting. There are other sculpture parks. Most of them are oriented in sort of a British model interior rather than to the exterior. And I often think part of the problem people have with David Smith is that when his works are exhibited indoors, I find them so naked, because they're missing, it's not just context, they're missing, it's like you've got skin or you've got a skeleton, no skin. It's just half a body. So I personally could not imagine your work. There are very few places I could imagine the work, because the relationship in steps from here to there to there to there is so integral to the finished product.
So then does this become this kind of...
No, it's a great question.
So then, I mean, one of the things that I thought about when I first arrived was the concept, the Wagnerian concept of the Gesamtkunstwerk, in fact, which is the complete work of art. I don't know enough about Bayreuth, perhaps you do, Mark. Really it's about the artist's desire to control the conditions under which their art is seen, because these things are often made in the studio, which are the perfect conditions in some respects, and wanting to control the work thereafter. Wagner sets up this whole building, which is, kind of overawing in terms of the senses. It doesn't leave anything out, in fact. So how are we to think of the park as a complete work of art in that sense?
I think that we have to now, and that's part of it. But in answering that, Maria, the first time I sent a piece away was the piece that went to Marlborough in New York, and that was like a crowning achievement from Hornby Island. And I hadn't even set the pieces up; they were just sort of hanging around. And when that piece left, it was like missing a tooth. I never recovered from that piece being moved until I actually brought it back here. So it was very painful, actually. And it wasn't even set up in any type of context or anything. I just missed that piece. So given a choice, I would think I would keep them together. You know, but MoMA's welcome to come here.
I mean, I disagree with everyone. I could see your work in a gallery. I could see it inside.
Well, it was designed to be
could.
able to live alone. You know, if it could survive the environment. This environment is crushing. This is like a crushing environment for a sculptor. It's not a compatible environment at all. It offers so much that the work itself seems so small and so human and like so paltry in this environment. But if the piece is strong enough, it can stand on its own. And so, yes, you can show it on its own. It was really meant to do that in the unfolding of this. But personally, it was, yeah, I can't imagine
Just
it
to
now.
finish on that, because we've taken icons, we've taken paintings that were parts of frescoes, and we hang them on the walls in galleries. I mean, there's been that transition. You know.
Just a small factual clarification here, Jeffrey. Is it literally true that there is not a single piece in this sculpture park that was made before the sculpture park existed, at least?
Only this lower work. This is the early work.
So, as far as that work is
Oh,
concerned,
when you say the sculpture park existed, the land
work
existed.
was prior to the sculpture park.
This was prior to being on Hornby. So it depends on where you want to put the sculpture park. Was it a sculpture park when I bought it as a farm? Well, it was really meant to be a repository, a life repository for work. At what point did it become a park? Well, I think after I started working it, then it became the issue of it. As I said, the issue firstly was whether or not the land itself would be the art and do a conceptual piece on the whole thing. I was imagining, you know, planting rows of sweet peas and, you know, different things on how you did the planting here so that you could see it from the air and it would be entirely different. That was when I was farming, and I thought like a farmer. But so where does the park begin? From my point of view, it's from the time that I bought it, but not really as the identity, because it didn't have the work to become the identity.
I have a quick question for Vaughan and then to Mark. Vaughan, you obviously, it's slightly different for painters, isn't it? I mean, how do you feel about selling a painting or seeing a painting go?
I've had a few that I wish I had. But sometimes for me it's a matter of making a buck too, so keep working away. I find this citing thing a really interesting thing too. It's a very intuitive thing, you know, like for Jeff to, like, even he might find the right spot, but is it turned exactly the right way? I mean, it's very fine, right? And a painter runs into this too. You can do a group of paintings that don't look like it. You like the painting, and then you put it in a certain place, and it just doesn't work, or and then you just change it around this way, and then it works. And what is that? I'm not quite sure. It's an aesthetic kind of thing that happens with. So Jeff's got a very keen sense of that how that should go, where it should go, and it's quite important, I think. It even, like last summer, I had a client that kept coming. He wanted a big piece for his brand new house, and he kept coming and taking I leave mine rolled up before these big things are on stretchers or whatever, and he'd take them home, and he went maybe 3, 4, 5 times. He'd come back, and I'd say, well, there's other artists. If you're not finding the right piece, you could, it's okay with me if you. But he kept digging, and then he finally found a piece that just looked like it actually belonged in this house, like it was meant to be in this house. So that's a curious sensibility about artwork, you know. And I do think like the whole thing really is a work of art in itself. This whole, it's like hanging a painting show too. When you finally get it right, it just seems right. Yeah.
We have Mark and then next up, and then we've got some other questions
Just
coming.
a quick comment. I really liked in Purdon's paper that he was talking a bit about the lichen and the different bird poop all over and how they're very organic pieces. So it's fascinating what you say, because we're used to seeing them change all the time, and very much in an outdoors context, but maybe that speaks more to the second question.
Mark?
I guess I'm still trying to define what we mean by sculpture parks. I'm interested, is it a park for sculpture or is it a sculpture park for people? Because it's an incredibly powerful experience coming here for the first time, and it feels very solitary and sort of incredibly personal, and that you move from sculpture to sculpture, but there's never a sense of scale and perspective and other human interaction given by seeing crowds of people moving through it, interacting it in their own way, responding to it in their own way. It is this sort of experience, you know. You see the sculptures in nature, not with people, and I think there's something very powerful about that. And also the way you're kind of curating it to be very controlled as well in the number of visitors you can have. So it always remains a very powerful experience. You know, it's not a sort of mass attraction. And it's not saying pejoratively one way or the other, but I'm interested whether, you know, that's a deliberate approach that you only want sort of 5 people here at once, and are they supposed to all move together, or there's a sort of accidental one person and a deer, or is it supposed to be a very personal route around and then the next person? And I guess also people who know it better and have come and seen it and maybe parted here as well.
Yeah, being in a small place, you know that there's only going to be a limited number of people who are going to go through the park more than once or twice, or whatever it happens to be. And what we've done is we've done openings. Before we were doing three a year. We would do opening to the public, and then I would volunteer and we would organize very small groups of artist-accompanied tours. So yesterday you had an artist-accompanied tour, so that would be taking a small group through, which allows them to see the work the way that we're talking about, see it in its, like walking through the woods, right? But then there's the openings, and then those are their own things too. And the public openings, and so we've had thousands of people through here now since we've been open. Well, thousands of visitors. Obviously, it could be in the same number. When Betty and I visited Storm King back in 1986, we went on a Sunday. We went from New York City, and so it was October. It was just an incredibly beautiful October day, and there couldn't have been more than 20 people in the entire park, which is much larger than this one, which was really quite incredible. And so, yeah, surprised there were no bus loads that day. Yeah, I guess it was just a day without bus loads of people. But we had the feeling, that we could actually look at the work and walk around, and that I thought, what was your impression at that point? Because there were very few people in the park. You remember?
Yes, I do recall that, because it was so. I had never seen sculptures sited that way on such a large piece of property before. That was early days for us, setting up this park. Being able to walk through some of the tall grass and watch it moving the way that we do here, and being on one site. We were there during Mark de Silvero large pieces exhibit.
That was actually the early days of their tall grass program.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's actually, you have to come back because it's
we will.
quite a bit.
Yes. So, yeah, that was quite a magnificent experience, yes. What I wanted to also add to the discussion, the question that you said, Mark, is on these openings to the public, we have these wonderful volunteers in Heather, Susan, Vaughn, Dick, and John, who mill about around the property, making sure that people don't go into the ponds, don't climb on the sculptures, don't go into our house, that sort of thing. And there can be anywhere up to 100 people at a time milling about, and that's quite wonderful. And I think, Karun, you have some really good photographs.
Yeah, in fact, I was just going to say, on the openings that we have had, it is a bit of a different scenario because it's more, you'll have children and, dogs and people milling around and people sitting down next to a sculpture or talking. So it's a much different experience. This is, we don't have openings now because, it doesn't make sense for numbers to do it this early in the season, but for this particular forum, we do it at this time because of the academic schedules and things. So you're seeing it in a bit of a different way. But yes, I can show you some pictures of how it kind of looks in a little bit different perspective.
So we've got about 5 minutes left on this question, and I know that Jenny wants to speak, Craig wants to speak, and maybe Joan if we've got time, and Karun would like to speak as well. Okay, so it's four statements, then maybe we can have a little coffee break.
I found I'm most interested in how we talk about citing and site-specific and the sculpture park. I mean, site-specific, I think, is a term that just kind of, not thrown about, but there's different degrees to say, like site-adjusted or determined or various. I know that one of the essays brought up, of course, the tilted arc controversy with Sarah, and as we go around the room, a few people say, well, I could imagine these sculptures in very few other places, or maybe in the gallery, or maybe many places. In the case of Tilted Arc, it's one place or it's no place. It was built for the site. It loses everything once it's not there. And in fact, it was removed, and it's, I suppose, cut up and stored somewhere, and Richard Serra is not allowing it to be anywhere else. It seems you speak of 1998 as being some kind of turn where it's more this permanent place siting. It was no longer just near the barn or having in mind of maybe we can move these out for a show or something. So part of what I'm looking for is where that, like, if it's 98, what series that is, where exactly that stands as far as things placed around the park. And then if it sounds to me more towards the leaning of these are cited as a grouping in this place. Like, it's not really up for, maybe it would be very difficult, let's say, to cite anywhere else or show anywhere else, considering that you've also done a lot to manufacture these sites as well in some cases.
Yeah, I'm not sure I quite understand the question, but yes, the sites were all planned at one point or another, all with a look as to sites themselves. Whether they were specific to the pieces, that was less so. So it was a matter of finding the right piece for the specific sites that had already been designed and built. So up until 98, we were still creating sites. And, what we would do is we'd have a kind of flooded area that needed a pond, and so it needed good drainage. If you put the pond in, you could then take the earth out of that pond and take a natural contour and build it up and have a better site for a piece of sculpture by virtue of actually draining the property. So you'd have both things working together. And so that was going on well into 2000. And then once I realized the park was full, we went into the upper regions, which were far more difficult to deal with. And so that was going on the whole time.
Yeah,
But what was important about 98 was that I just was fed up with New York. My proposition was, you make it in New York or you don't make it anywhere else. So New York was the only interest that I had in where the pieces might be shown, partly because there were people in New York who knew who David Smith was. They're just so much more knowledgeable about sculpture there than anywhere else that I had been. So it was a New York or nothing proposition. We had exhausted New York by 1998. My friend and I had a falling out, which was really very severe for good friends for 30 years. And so it just became time to forget about New York. You've done your New York thing, you've done your shows, you've got some reviews, didn't have much in the way of sales, but you know what? We had these little blue chip pieces that anyone could buy and fit in an apartment, and they weren't expensive. And we didn't sell them. I did a show with a guy by the name of, so maybe it was our location. We did a show with same type of show with Beatleston Gallery. He was right at 57 and 5th across the street from Tiffany's. He didn't sell anything either. So it was just those years, nothing was selling. And if nothing sells in a dealer's mind, that's it. They're not museums. They don't redo. So it was just saying, forget about New York. It's time to come home. It's time to concentrate on what you had planned all these years anyway. So there was always this contingency. Had the market ever shown itself to be headed this way, I don't know what I would have done. I would have sold some pieces, and was doing smaller pieces at the time. So that would have been series number 6.
Series 6, okay.
Yeah.
Jenny, do you want to make a statement, and then we'll just have Karun and Joan, and we're closing in on break time.
I think it's worth considering sort of adding a bit to this original question. Also, maybe how important is the sculpture part to understanding Jeff's sort of assessment of art history and your efforts to intervene in it or contribute to it? Because if I can just say personally, I think I understood the principles of visual counterpart here for the first time ever. Mm-hmm. And after repeat visits. Mm-hmm. And I have to say, I think this really just occurred to me, but I think using this sculpture where it is as a sort of introduction before you sort of go over to the hill and see the whole thing unfold is really, really wonderful, because I think it's a nice summary of counterpoint. As you make I think, a point and ask everybody to sort of stop and walk around and understand why the sort of planar piece is situated exactly where it is, and then we can think about how it reflects and the changing of the seasons and the pigeons and all of this. And I think this sort of surprised me in the first couple of visits, that now I would really come here and immediately begin to see, it doesn't matter to me whether there are people in the picture, and in fact having people in it just sort of underscores the point that I can see evolution because of having your narrative and what you've said about on various tours. In addition to seeing counterpoint in the landscape, which thanks to you I now see everywhere, or I see as a lack in other landscapes, I see how you're engaged with the cave painters, or Michelangelo, and this really particular thread of art history that you've identified is really being key to understanding sort of the humanist impulse to sort of creating harmony in our relationships with one another and in institutions, and I really, again, I think that it's really key to come here repeatedly if possible, to really sort of over time kind of developed a nuanced and layered appreciation for your thinking and efforts to engage. Yeah, and I don't see it as possible outside the park now. Yeah. Yeah.
Joan and then Karun.
That's a very whoops. I wanted to ask, did you have a model when you started this? Were you looking to what you knew of Bolton Landing? Did you know about David Smith's fields?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And what did you know?
Well, what I knew was
what did he know?
it was my
When did
little
he know?
handbook. It was my little handbook, which I bought in 1969 on a remainder shelf on David Smith.
I wonder
which
whether
was
that's
the year that it was the year that it was published. I not only
I wonder whether that's question 2, which we're coming to, which is the David Smith influence. I don't want
Okay,
us to
we can
slip
do-
too
we
much
can-
into that.
We can do that. No, I just was thinking about fields and fields.
Yeah, so
we can
you
wait.
have to know how an artist looks at another artist, which you may or may not be an artist, and other people can have that perception too, but you see things through that artist's eyes. And so his black and white photographs to me are not black and white photographs. They're the eye of looking through to those fields and looking through to the work in those fields. Then there's some color shots in that particular book. That book, until your book came along, is the book that I've been carrying around, and I've bought tattered copies and even a decent copy from Abe Books, so that I have several of them. Yeah, I think I gave one to Maria, one of my tattered copies, the paper ones, but it's it. You know, the 69 edition is disappearing, but I still have some copies of it. But thanks to you, I have a new book on David Smith, which I really enjoy, which I really like.
Final statement, question, Karu.
So I have a question because of this 1998 date, and there's a piece in Series 6 that I really like, which is, I think it's Clio 2 or Clio 4. It's the reed piece.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of a tripod piece with a sort of splayed sphere, and it's just very, very, Clio
Oh,
6,
that one is
Clio 6.
that's 1989 or 1990,
I mean,
maybe.
I see there are certain references, and I think Mazuris pointed this out nicely too, these references to naturalistic images and subject matters are really obvious in the later series, which you'll get to, those of you who haven't had that part of the tour yet, in the coming days. And I'm wondering, in relation to the site, how much did the site or things on the site inspire you? I'm also thinking about colors, because there's very specific colors of this landscape, which maybe this is the Canadian part of the question. The blues, the slate blues, and working with you so long, I know that slate blue comes up as a color you want me to use a lot. This kind of the emerald greens and the specific colors of the trees, how they work with the sculpture. So, in terms of the forms of the sculpture, the vertebrae series, the Burgess Shale, which is, of course, a Canadian kind of first find as well. Could you kind of link or give us your thinking on how the site inspired any of that? Is that a valid connection in your mind, or is that just something we're seeing?
No, I think it's valid, but it's one of those things where it becomes my breathing environment. And so I breathe it, and it becomes very hard unless I'm out of it to like be as strongly aware of it, because it's just part of what it is that I do. And I really felt like those pieces were really just incorporated into the sense of it growing out of the landscape.
Well, that's interesting. The last question I have is that the final series, Series 9, it felt like those were very specifically, you'd made the sites and the pieces specifically for those sites, and the piece that you made for John. And I'm wondering if there was a shift towards the end as sites got fewer and fewer, whether it wasn't so much that you made the piece and then put it somewhere and it rang in, but you really had the awareness of the geography and all the color and all the space as you were making the piece. Was there a difference as time went on? Was it all the same?
I would say that the core 10 pieces themselves loan themselves, in my mind, well to winter as well as to spring. The stainless steel ones, because of their reflectivity, loan themselves somewhat better to sunlight and to the colors. So I would say that there's a different lean in here. The site-specific ones were, yes, there's two bases here. One is we know that there's just a limited number of sites that we've designed, that John and I have designed for. And so it makes sense for them to be site-specific in order to get a grouping that can maximize the sites themselves. The colors, of course, are always the winter colors are also fantastic here. I have said that there are two magical lights in this world to me. One is the rosy light of Florence, which is incredible. It just always amazes me when I'm there. And the other light, which is the cool light of here, is the other best light that I've ever seen.